The invisible work of the hum of plasma conduits filled the maintenance shaft as Marcus Chen carefully adjusted his position, squeezing his lean frame between two massive power couplings. His weathered hands, scarred from years of working with superheated metal and volatile energy systems, moved with practiced precision as he guided the molecular welder along the junction seam. At 34 years old, Marcus had spent the last 12 years maintaining the fleet vessels of the Galactic Alliance, and in all that time, he could count on one hand the number of times any of his alien superiors had spoken directly to him. The Galactic Alliance was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, at least according to the propaganda broadcasts. 47 different alien civilizations working together for peace and prosperity across the galaxy. Humans, having joined only years ago after finally achieving faster-than-light travel, were considered the newest and least advanced members. They were given maintenance roles, support positions, jobs that kept them useful but invisible. Marcus preferred it that way. While other humans complained about the lack of recognition or advancement opportunities, he found peace in the rhythmic work of keeping machines running. Every ship had its own personality, its own quirks and problems that only came to light after months of careful observation. The Horizon's Edge, a massive Alliance dreadnought, had become his specialty. He knew every corridor, every system, every bolt that held her together. As he completed the weld and began packing up his equipment, a soft chime indicated an incoming message on his personal communicator. Chen, report to Bay 7 immediately. Priority maintenance required on the new shield generators. The voice belonged to Supervisor Kellax, a tall, crystalline being from the Thraxian homeworld who oversaw all maintenance operations aboard the Horizon's Edge. Marcus sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The new shield generators had been installed 3 weeks ago, part of a fleet-wide upgrade that supposedly made Alliance vessels invulnerable to enemy fire. The technology came from the Vorthok, an ancient species whose mastery of energy manipulation was legendary throughout the galaxy. Every ship in the fleet now carried the advanced shields, and the Alliance leadership spoke confidently about their technological superiority. Bay 7 hummed with activity as Marcus arrived, his toolcase slung over his shoulder. The shield generator dominated the center of the bay, a crystalline structure that pulsed with blue energy. It was beautiful in its alien elegance, but Marcus had noticed something troubling during his previous inspections. The power distribution network fed energy to the generator through a series of quantum tunnels, but the tunnels themselves were positioned directly adjacent to the ship's primary cooling system without proper isolation barriers. He'd tried to mention it to Supervisor Kellax 2 weeks ago, but the Thraxian had dismissed his concerns with barely concealed irritation. Human, the Vorthok have been manipulating energy for over 10,000 years. Do you seriously suggest that your species, which achieved spaceflight only decades ago, has discovered a flaw that escaped their notice? Marcus had retreated into silence, as he always did when faced with such dismissal. But the problem remained, gnawing at him every time he performed maintenance in this section. Under normal conditions, the cooling system operated at temperatures that wouldn't affect the quantum tunnels. But in combat, when the shields were under heavy bombardment and the cooling system was running at maximum capacity, the interaction between the two systems could cause catastrophic feedback. He approached the generator and began his diagnostic routine. Running his scanner along the power distribution network, the readings confirmed his fears. Micro-fluctuations in the quantum field were already detectable, growing stronger each time the shields cycled through their charging sequence. It was like watching a crack slowly spread across a dam, knowing that eventually it would give way. Human Chen, the voice made him jump. Supervisor Kellex had approached silently, her crystalline form refracting the bay's lighting into dancing patterns on the walls. Status report on the generator systems. Marcus looked up from his scanner, choosing his words carefully. All systems are functioning within normal parameters, Supervisor. However, I've detected some minor quantum field fluctuations that might indicate what, exactly? Calax's tone carried the particular condescension reserved for explaining obvious things to slow children. The Vorthok technology is precise beyond your comprehension. These fluctuations are part of the normal operational cycle. With respect, Supervisor, I believe the proximity of the cooling system enough. Kelex's crystalline form darkened, a sign of anger among her species. You will complete your assigned maintenance and return to your duties. Do not waste my time with baseless theories about technology you cannot possibly understand. Marcus nodded and resumed his work, but his mind raced with possibilities. If he was right about the shield vulnerability, every ship in the fleet was essentially defenseless, despite carrying the most advanced defensive technology in known space. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very system designed to protect them might be their greatest weakness. 3 hours later, as Marcus was securing his equipment, the ship's emergency klaxons began wailing. Red warning lights bathed the corridors in crimson as personnel rushed to battle stations. Over the intercom, Captain Thorne's voice echoed through the ship. All hands to battle stations. Coalition forces have been detected entering the system. This is not a drill. The Coalition. Marcus had heard the reports, fragments of information that filtered down to the maintenance crews. A rebel faction of various alien species who opposed the Alliance's expansion policies. They'd been conducting hit-and-run attacks on outlying colonies for months, but nothing like a direct assault on a fleet installation. Marcus found himself swept along with the flow of personnel, moving toward designated emergency stations. As a maintenance engineer, his assignment during combat was auxiliary engineering, where he would monitor ship systems and respond to battle damage. The auxiliary control room was located deep within the ship's core, surrounded by layers of armor and redundant systems. When he arrived, the auxiliary engineering bay was a hive of controlled chaos. Engineers from multiple species worked at monitoring stations, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and electronic tones. Marcus took his assigned position at a human-designed console, one of the few interfaces on the ship that had been configured for human ergonomics. On the main tactical display, he could see the battle unfolding. The Coalition fleet was smaller than expected, perhaps 30 vessels against the Alliance force of over 100 ships. But the enemy ships were moving with unusual coordination, their weapons fire concentrated and precise. Shield strength holding at 97%, reported Engineer Vex, a insectoid Kitharan whose compound eyes could process multiple data streams simultaneously. The new Vorthok systems are performing exactly as predicted. Marcus watched his own displays, monitoring the shield generators throughout the fleet. The quantum field fluctuations he'd detected earlier were becoming more pronounced under combat. Conditions exactly as he'd feared. The cooling systems across the fleet were running at maximum capacity, and the interference with the quantum tunnels was building toward a critical threshold. "Sir," Marcus called out to Chief Engineer Torvin, a massive Gorvani whose species served as the backbone of Alliance engineering corps. I'm reading anomalous quantum signatures from multiple vessels. The shield generators continue monitoring human. Torvin rumbled without looking up from his own station. The Vorthok technology requires no input from your species. On the tactical display, Marcus watched as coalition forces pressed their attack. Their weapons were primitive compared to Alliance technology, but they seemed to be targeting specific points on each ship's hull with surgical precision. It was almost as if they knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. Asterisk. Then it happened. The Alliance vessel Stellar Dawn, positioned at the front of the formation, suddenly flared with brilliant light. For a moment, Marcus thought it was just the normal glow of energy shields under heavy bombardment. Then he realized the truth: the ship's shields weren't deflecting the enemy fire. They were amplifying it. Stellar Dawn is reporting catastrophic shield failure, announced Engineer Vex, her voice tight with confusion. Quantum field collapse is causing feedback through their entire defensive grid. More ships began experiencing similar failures. The Pride of Centauri, the Voidwalker, the New Horizon, one by one. The most advanced vessels in the Alliance fleet found their supposedly impenetrable shields turning against them. What should have been their greatest protection became a weapon in enemy hands. Marcus watched in horror as the pattern repeated across the fleet. The coalition forces seemed to understand exactly what was happening, concentrating their fire on ships just as their shields reached a critical failure point. It wasn't luck or superior tactics. They knew about the flaw. All ships implement emergency shield shutdown, came Captain Thorne's voice over the communication system. Repeat, all vessels shut down shield generators immediately. But it was too late for many ships. Nearly a quarter of the Alliance fleet had suffered catastrophic damage. Their own defensive systems turned against them by an enemy who clearly understood the vulnerability better than the Alliance leadership. Marcus looked at his console, then at the quantum field readings he'd been tracking. The human ships in the fleetholder vessels that had been retrofitted with the new energy were showing the same dangerous fluctuations. In minutes, they too would reach the critical threshold, unless someone did something about it, without requesting permission or explaining his actions. Marcus began rerouting power flow through the auxiliary systems he controlled. It was dangerous and completely unauthorized, but he knew these ships better than anyone. If he could create alternative pathways for the cooling system energy, isolate the quantum tunnels from the thermal interference, he might be able to prevent the cascade failure. His fingers flew across the console, implementing modifications that existed nowhere in any technical manual. He rerouted coolant flow through secondary systems, created buffer zones using maintenance power conduits, and established entirely new energy distribution networks that bypassed the problematic junctions around him. Other engineers continued to monitor the battle, unaware that one human was desperately trying to save their lives. Marcus worked in silence, sweat beading on his forehead as he fought against time and physics. The quantum field fluctuations were approaching critical levels, but his modifications were having an effect. The dangerous resonance patterns were beginning to stabilize. On the tactical display, he watched as more Alliance ships fell victim to their own shields. But the human vessels, the Earth Defense Force, cruiser Defiant, the colony ship New Boston, the patrol vessel Horizon Guard continued to fight effectively. Their shields held, their systems remained stable, their crews survived. How are the human ships maintaining shield integrity? Chief Engineer Torvin demanded, his massive form turning toward Marcus's station. Their technology should be experiencing The same failures as our advanced vessels. Marcus looked up from his console, meeting the Gorvani's 4 eyes. For the first time in his career, he had the attention of his superiors, not because of his mistakes, but because of his success. I implemented emergency modifications to prevent quantum field collapse, he said simply. The cooling system interference was causing cascade failures in the shield generators. I created alternative power routing to eliminate the problem. The auxiliary engineering bay fell silent except for the distant sounds of battle. Every alien engineer was staring at the human who had apparently solved a problem that had destroyed a quarter of their fleet. You modified Alliance systems without authorization. Torvin's voice carried dangerous undertones. Yes, sir. And these modifications are preventing the shield failures. Yes, sir. Torvin studied Marcus for a long moment, then activated his communication system. Bridge, this is auxiliary engineering. We have identified the cause of the shield failures and implemented a solution. Request permission to extend modifications to all remaining vessels. Captain Thorne's voice crackled through the speakers. Explain the situation, Chief. One of our human engineers discovered that the Vorthok shield technology has a critical vulnerability. Thermal interference from cooling systems causes quantum field collapse under combat conditions. He has developed a workaround that appears to be effective. A pause. Then, the human engineer, Marcus Chen. Marcus blinked in surprise. He hadn't realized the captain even knew his name. Yes, sir. Engineer Chen has successfully prevented shield failures on all human vessels in the fleet. Implement his modifications immediately across all ships, and bring Engineer Chen to the bridge. I want to speak with him personally. As Marcus gathered his equipment and prepared to leave auxiliary engineering, he caught sight of the tactical display one more time. The battle was turning. With stable shields, the Alliance vessels were beginning to push back against the coalition forces. The human ships, having never lost their defensive capabilities, were leading the counterattack for the first time in 12 years of service. Marcus Chen was no longer invisible. Asterisk, the turning point, the bridge of the horizon's edge was a cathedral of technology with soaring displays showing tactical information from across the star system. Marcus had never been here before. Maintenance engineers were rarely summoned to the command center of a vessel. He stood awkwardly near the communications station, still wearing his grease-stained work coveralls, while around him the senior officers of the ship coordinated the largest space battle in recent Alliance history. Captain Alina Thorne was a veteran of 30 years in the Alliance fleet, one of the few humans to achieve command rank. Her steel-grey hair was pulled back in a regulation knot, and her weathered face showed the stress of commanding a vessel with over 3,000 souls aboard. When she turned to look at Marcus, her expression was unreadable. Engineer Chen, she said in a voice that carried across the bridge despite the surrounding activity. Chief Torvin tells me you've solved our shield problem. I found a temporary workaround, Captain, Marcus replied, uncomfortably aware that every alien officer on the bridge was listening. The Vorthok technology has a design flaw that causes feedback under specific thermal conditions. I created alternative power routing to prevent the cascade failure, a design flaw. Captain Thorne's tone was carefully neutral. In technology developed by a species that has been manipulating energy since before humans discovered fire. Marcus swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am, the quantum tunnels are positioned too close to the primary cooling system. Under combat stress, thermal interference creates resonance patterns in the quantum field. Eventually, the field collapses and the shields amplify incoming energy instead of deflecting it. Tactical Officer Zenth, a tall Xerian with blue skin, looked up from his station. "Captain, the humans' modifications are holding. All vessels that have implemented his changes are maintaining full shield effectiveness. But we're still losing ships that haven't been modified yet." On the main view screen, Marcus could see the battle raging across the star system. Alliance. Vessels were scattered in small groups, some fighting effectively with stable shields, others struggling with failing defensive systems. The coalition forces seemed to understand exactly which ships were vulnerable, concentrating their attacks. On vessels still using unmodified Vorthok technology, "How long to implement your modifications across the entire fleet?" Captain Thorne asked. Barkus considered the question. "With proper engineering teams, maybe 6 hours per ship. But we don't have 6 hours, and we don't have enough engineers who understand the modifications." "Then what do you suggest?" The question caught Marcus off guard. In 12 years of service, no superior officer had ever asked for his suggestions on anything more complex than optimal maintenance schedules. He looked at the tactical display, studying the positions of friendly and enemy forces, then at the technical readouts showing which Alliance vessels were still vulnerable. "We need to get me onto the other ships," he said finally. "I can modify their systems directly, but I'll need access to their engineering sections." "Impossible," interjected Commander Varix, the ship's Thraxian executive officer. "Coalition forces control the space between our vessel groups. Any shuttle attempting to cross that gap would be destroyed." Marcus studied the tactical display more carefully. The coalition fleet was arranged in a rough sphere around the scattered Alliance forces, using hit-and-run tactics to prevent regrouping. But their formation had gaps, spaces where a small, fast ship might be able to slip through undetected. "Not necessarily," he said. "Look at the sensor shadows created by the asteroid field. A maintenance pod could use those shadows for cover, moving from ship to ship without being detected." A maintenance pod. Commander Varix's crystalline form shimmered with what Marcus had learned to recognize as amusement. "Those vessels have no weapons, minimal shielding, and life support for perhaps 4 hours. You would be completely defenseless." "But I'd be invisible," Marcus pointed out. "Coalition forces are concentrating on military vessels. They wouldn't waste ammunition on a maintenance pod, especially one following standard repair protocols." Captain Thorne moved to the tactical station, studying the display with professional interest. "Show me the route you're proposing." Marcus approached the display, using his finger to trace a path through the asteroid field. "Here, using asteroid TK7741 as cover. Then, along this vector to reach the stellar mite. From there, I could jump to the Void Seeker, then the new Carthage. Each ship I modify becomes a safe harbor for the next jump." "The distances are enormous," observed Navigation Officer Kelt, a insectoid Kitharan. "Even with maximum fuel reserves, a maintenance pod couldn't complete such a circuit." "It could if the pod was stripped down to essentials," Marcus replied. "Remove everything except life support, propulsion, and the equipment I need for modifications. Use the saved weight capacity for extra fuel cells." The bridge fell silent except for the distant rumble of weapons, fire, and the constant stream of tactical reports from other vessels. Marcus could feel the weight of attention from every officer present, most of whom had never given him a second thought during his years of service. "The plan has merit," Captain Thorne said finally, "but it's incredibly dangerous. One mistake, one sensor contact, and you'll be vaporized before you can even attempt to help anyone. Captain, Marcus said quietly, if we don't try something, the coalition is going to pick off our ships one by one. They know about the shield vulnerability. They're using it against us. Every minute we delay, more people die. Captain Thorne studied him for a long moment. Very well. Commander Varix, prepare Maintenance Pod 7 for long-range operations. Strip everything non-essential and install extra fuel cells. Engineering teams are to provide Engineer Chen with whatever modifications equipment he requires. Captain, Commander, Varix protested, you're sending one human in an unarmed pod against an entire enemy fleet. The risk is acceptable, Thorne interrupted. Compared to losing the entire fleet to our own defensive systems. She turned back to Marcus. You have 2 hours to prepare. Make them count. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Marcus worked with the ship's engineering teams to load the maintenance pod with everything he would need. Molecular welders, quantum field generators, power routing equipment, and most importantly, the detailed specifications for his shield modifications. The pod's interior was cramped even under normal circumstances, but with the additional equipment, Marcus would barely have room to move. Chief Engineer Torvan supervised the preparations personally, his massive Gorvani frame moving with surprising grace through the tight spaces. Human Chen, he said, as Marcus tested the pod's modified systems, I owe you an apology. I dismissed your concerns about the shield technology because I believed superior species could not make such fundamental errors. Marcus looked up from his equipment check. You weren't wrong about their superiority, sir. The Vorthok are incredibly advanced, but sometimes being too advanced means you miss simple problems. They built quantum tunnels that worked perfectly in laboratory conditions but didn't account for the chaotic thermal environment of a combat situation. And you saw this because I'm used to making broken things work, Marcus said simply. Most of my career has been spent fixing systems that weren't designed to work together, finding ways to make incompatible technologies cooperate. The Vorthok built elegant solutions for ideal conditions. I'm used to building ugly solutions for impossible conditions. Torvan's 4 eyes studied Marcus with new respect. The ugly solutions that work are often more valuable than elegant solutions that fail. As Marcus completed his final preparations, Captain Thorne arrived in the maintenance bay. She carried a small device that she handed to him, a long-range communicator designed for covert operations. This will let you maintain contact with the fleet even when you're deep in coalition-controlled space, she explained, but use it sparingly. Every transmission risks giving away your position. Marcus clipped the communicator to his belt and sealed his emergency suit. The next few hours would determine whether his plan could save the fleet or whether he would simply become another casualty in humanity's first major space battle since joining the Alliance. Good luck, engineer, Captain Thorne said as he climbed into the maintenance pod. The pod's launch was deliberately unremarkable. Rather than using the main launch bays, Marcus departed through a maintenance hatch typically used for routine external repairs. His pod drifted away from the horizon's edge at minimal velocity. Just another piece of debris in a battle zone filled with wreckage and destroyed equipment. For the first hour, Marcus held his breath every time his sensors detected nearby ships. Coalition vessels passed within kilometers of his position, their powerful scanners sweeping space for threats, but they ignored the small maintenance pod, focusing instead on the military vessels that posed actual danger. Navigation through the asteroid field was nerve-wracking work. The pod's basic sensors could detect the largest obstacles, but smaller debris required constant vigilance. Marcus found himself drawing on years of experience maneuvering through the cramped spaces inside Alliance vessels, treating the asteroid field like just another maintenance shaft he needed to navigate. His first destination was the Alliance cruiser Stellarmite, a Vorthak-designed vessel that was struggling to maintain shield integrity under constant Coalition harassment. Marcus approached the ship from its blind spot, using the cruiser's own bulk to mask his pod's heat signature from enemy sensors. Docking with the Stellarmite was a challenge. The ship's docking bays were sealed for combat operations, and requesting permission to dock would alert Coalition forces to his presence. Instead, Marcus used the pod's magnetic clamps to attach to the ship's hull near a maintenance airlock. The process took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, during which any stray shot from the ongoing battle could have destroyed him instantly. Once aboard the Stellarmite, Marcus faced the challenge of explaining his presence to a crew that had never heard of him. The ship's captain, an elderly Vorthok named Separenth, initially refused to believe that a human maintenance engineer could solve problems that Vorthok scientists had not anticipated. "Your species achieved spaceflight less than a century ago," Separenth said, his crystalline form pulsing with dismissive energy patterns. "You suggest that you understand our technology better than we do. I suggest that I understand how your technology fails under conditions you never tested," Marcus replied patiently. "Your shields work perfectly in ideal situations. But space battles aren't ideal situations." It took 30 minutes of argument and demonstration before Serenth allowed Marcus access to the ship's shield generators. But once Marcus began implementing his modifications, the results spoke for themselves. The quantum field fluctuations that had been building toward critical failure began to stabilize. The shields that had been on the verge of collapse strengthened and held. "Impossible," Serenth whispered, watching his displays show shield integrity, rising to levels not seen since the battle began. "The quantum matrix is stabilizing. How did you achieve this?" Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead, exhausted from the delicate work of rewiring Vorthok technology. "I gave the quantum field somewhere else to go. Instead of building up resonance in the tunnels, the excess energy gets redirected through secondary pathways that can handle the thermal load." The modifications took 3 hours to complete, but when Marcus departed the Stellarmite, the cruiser was once again a formidable fighting vessel. His next destination was the destroyer Void Seeker, then the heavy cruiser New Carthage, then the supply vessel Prosperity Station. Each ship presented unique challenges, different designs, different crew species, different technological approaches to the same underlying problem. But Marcus had learned something important. During his years as a maintenance engineer, every machine, no matter how complex or alien, followed certain basic principles. Energy had to go somewhere. Heat had to be dissipated. Force had to be transferred. The specific technologies might be beyond human understanding, but the fundamental physics remained constant. As he worked his way through the fleet, Marcus began to see the larger pattern of the battle. The Coalition forces weren't just randomly attacking, they were systematically targeting ships with unmodified shields, using their knowledge of the Vorthok vulnerability to maximum advantage. It was a brilliant strategy that turned the Alliance's technological superiority into a critical weakness. But it was also a strategy that depended on the Alliance not understanding what was happening. As more ships received Marcus's modifications, the Coalition's advantage began to erode. Vessels that had been easy targets suddenly became dangerous opponents again. The tactical balance of the battle began to shift. Marcus was aboard his seventh ship, the battle cruiser Iron Will, when the coalition forces finally noticed a pattern. His presence was discovered not by enemy sensors, but by the simple fact that ships were recovering their combat effectiveness in a way that shouldn't have been possible. "Coalition forces are converging on our position," announced the Iron Will's tactical officer, a nervous Xyrian named Kelth. "They appear to be targeting ships that have regained shield functionality." Marcus looked up from his work on the ship's shield generators. He was exhausted, having worked for nearly 18 hours straight, but the modifications were almost complete. "How long until they arrive?" 20 minutes at current velocity, Captain Voss replied. She was a Terran like Marcus, one of the few humans to command a major Alliance vessel. "Can you finish the modifications?" "Maybe," Marcus said, returning to his work. "But even if I do, one ship can't fight an entire coalition squadron." "It won't be one ship," Captain Voss said grimly. "Every vessel you've modified is converging on our position. If we're going to make a stand, we'll do it together." On the tactical displays, Marcus could see the Alliance formation taking shape. 7 ships, each with fully functional shields thanks to his modifications, moving into defensive positions around the Iron Will. It wasn't enough firepower to win the battle, but it might be enough to survive until reinforcements arrived. The coalition attack came with devastating precision. 12 enemy vessels, including 2 heavy cruisers, unleashed everything they had against the Alliance formation. But this time, the Alliance shields held. Energy that should have caused catastrophic feedback was harmlessly deflected. Weapons that should have been amplified by failing defensive systems struck impenetrable barriers. For the first time since the battle began, the Alliance forces had a technological advantage. Their shields worked as designed. Their weapons fired at maximum efficiency. Their crews fought with the confidence that comes from knowing your equipment won't betray you. The battle lasted for hours. When it ended, 5 coalition vessels had been destroyed and the remainder were in full retreat. The Alliance had lost no ships, though several had taken heavy damage. Most importantly, word of Marcus's shield modifications was spreading throughout the fleet. Every Alliance vessel was requesting immediate technical assistance. Marcus found himself summoned to the fleet flagship, the massive dreadnought Galactic Unity, where Admiral Corthax himself wanted to understand how a human maintenance engineer had solved a problem that had stumped the greatest scientific minds in the Alliance. Admiral Corthax was an ancient elder, one of the founding species of the Alliance, whose crystalline form towered over even the tallest humans. His presence was intimidating, but his questions were precise and focused. "Engineer Chen," the Admiral said, his voice resonating through harmonic frequencies that Marcus felt as much as heard. "Explain to me how you identified a flaw that escaped detection by Vorthok scientists." Marcus stood at attention in the Admiral's private briefing room, acutely aware that he was probably the lowest-ranking individual ever to be granted a personal audience with the fleet commander. "Sir, I noticed anomalous quantum field readings during routine maintenance. The fluctuations were small, but they followed a pattern that suggested thermal interference. And you concluded from this that the entire Vorthok shield system was flawed." "No, sir. I concluded that the system might fail under specific conditions that hadn't been tested. The Vorthok designed perfect shields for perfect conditions, but combat conditions are never perfect." Admiral Corthax studied Marcus with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The Vorthok are proud, he said, finally. They do not easily accept that their designs might be improved upon, especially by younger species. Your modifications work, but implementing them across the entire Alliance fleet will require delicate diplomacy. Sir, with respect, people are dying while we worry about diplomacy, Marcus said. Every hour we delay, more ships are lost to their own defensive systems. You propose to ignore the political implications of your discovery. Marcus met the admiral's gaze steadily. I propose to save lives, sir. The politics can be sorted out after we win the war. Admiral Corthax was silent for a long moment. Then, incredibly, the ancient being began to emit the harmonic patterns that Marcus had learned indicated amusement. You sound like your Captain Thorn. Very well, Engineer Chen. You will have full authority to implement your modifications across the entire fleet. The political consequences will be my responsibility. Over the next week, Marcus found himself leading teams of engineers from dozens of species, teaching them to implement his shield modifications on every vessel in the Alliance fleet. It was challenging work. Each species had different approaches to technology, different ways of understanding quantum mechanics, different cultural attitudes toward modifying existing designs. But gradually, the fleet began to transform. Ships that had been vulnerable to their own defensive systems became formidable fighting vessels again. The coalition forces, dependent on exploiting the shield vulnerability, found themselves facing an enemy that was no longer betrayed by its own technology. The war's turning point came at the Battle of Kepler Station, where the fully modified Alliance fleet met the main coalition armada in the largest space battle in galactic history. The coalition forces, expecting to face the same vulnerable ships they had been defeating for months, instead encountered a completely transformed enemy, Alliance. Shields held under the heaviest bombardment. Weapon systems operated at peak efficiency. Ships that should have been easy targets became indestructible fortresses. The battle lasted 18 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the coalition fleet. In the aftermath, as damage, reports came in and casualty lists were compiled. One fact stood out above all others. Not a single Alliance vessel had been lost to shield failure. Marcus's modifications had saved thousands of lives and prevented the collapse of the entire Alliance. 6 months later, Marcus Chen stood in the same maintenance shaft where his story had begun, but everything had changed. The uniform he wore now bore the insignia of Chief Fleet Engineer, the first human ever appointed to such a position in Alliance history. The Galactic Council had not only accepted his modifications, but had requested that he oversee the development of next-generation defensive systems for the entire Alliance fleet. The Vorthok, initially resistant to the idea that their technology could be improved, had eventually embraced Marcus's innovations with characteristic thoroughness. They had offered him a position in their most advanced research facilities, an honor never before extended to a member of a younger species. But Marcus had declined. He preferred to remain where he was, in the maintenance shafts and engineering bays of the Alliance fleet, solving problems that others couldn't see and fixing systems that others considered perfect. It was work that suited him, work that made a difference, work that had literally changed the course of galactic history.